I'm James. I'm 41 years old, and before that night, I would have described myself as a man who valued logic, common sense, and the kind of quiet solitude you can only find deep within the untouched parts of the world. I was a cartographer, and 2 years ago, I had moved to a tiny, rented cabin on the ragged fringes of Wolfe County, Kentucky. It was supposed to be a temporary retreat, a place to finish a large-scale project mapping the lesser-known tributaries of the Red River Gorge area. It was remote, secluded enough that the nearest neighbor was a 7-mile hike through dense woodland, and that isolation was the exact thing I craved. But solitude has a dark side. It doesn't just keep the world out, it traps you with what's already there. The night it all began, I wasn't settling in for a quiet evening of drafting. I was standing 10 feet from my rusted Ford F-150, which was stalled out on the narrow, gravel logging path, the only way in or out of my cabin. A sudden, vicious downpour had struck around 6 p.m., turning the path into a slick, muddy trench. I'd spent an hour trying to winch the truck out, but the ground was too saturated. I finally gave up and tossed the useless wire into the bed, utterly defeated, when I noticed something profoundly wrong with the truck itself. It wasn't just stuck, the driver's side door was buckled. Not scraped from a rock or dented from a tree, but actively crumpled inward, as though something massive and strong had tried to pry it open like a can of tuna. The rain had washed most of the mud and grime off, leaving the twisted metal exposed under the weak beam of my headlamp. My heart, which had been merely annoyed a moment before, dropped into my stomach and started hammering against my ribs. I hadn't seen anyone in weeks. Deer, yes. Black bears, occasionally. But nothing that could bend half-inch steel. I got out my phone, no signal, which was expected. I decided I would walk back to the cabin, grab my old pump-action shotgun, and come back at first light to survey the damage properly. As I started walking back down the path, the hair on the back of my neck prickled. The woods, which were usually a symphony of crickets, frogs, and wind, were dead silent. The rain had stopped as abruptly as it began, and the air was thick, heavy, and cold. That's when I heard the breathing. It wasn't a cough, or a growl, or a roar. It was a wet, ragged, asthmatic sound, like air being forced through a throat full of gravel and mucus. It was close, too close, and low to the ground. Every single survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, but my feet were cemented to the wet earth. I slowly raised my headlamp, shining the beam into the thicket just beyond the left side of the path, maybe 20 feet away. The light caught two eyes. They weren't reflecting the light like a raccoon's or a deer's. They were deep-set, malignant, and absorbed the light, glowing faintly from within with a sickly yellow hue. They were too wide apart and set in a head that was too broad to belong to any known Appalachian predator. I couldn't make out a shape, just the heavy, awful sound of inhalation and exhalation, and the feeling that I was being analyzed, measured, and judged. Then, the silence was broken by the sound of movement. Not running, but a sudden, terrifying shift in weight, a low-slung, powerful lunge that sent the underbrush snapping and tearing. I didn't think, I sprinted. I ran back toward the cabin, fueled by pure, blinding panic. The cabin was a modest structure, wooden planks, concrete foundation, and a small, enclosed porch. I hit the porch steps and fumbled for the key, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't aim the key at the lock. The breathing sound was closer now, behind me, accompanied by a heavy, irregular thudding on the forest floor. It wasn't the gait of a four-legged animal, it sounded like something incredibly heavy running awkwardly on two legs. I finally rammed the key home, twisted, and threw myself inside, slamming the wooden door shut and throwing the iron bolt home. I stood there, leaning against the cold wood, gasping for air, clutching my knees. Then, the first impact. It was a sound of wood meeting bone-jarring mass, a thunderous crash that rattled the single glass pane in the window and sent a shower of dirt from the chimney pipe. It was the loudest, most violent sound I have ever heard, and it was directed at the door I was leaning on. I scrambled away, heart now in full fibrillation. I grabbed the shotgun from the rack above the fireplace, a relic, but reliable, and loaded 3 shells, the heavy shunk of the action feeling pitifully weak against the silence that followed the impact. I crept to the window and slowly, cautiously, peeked out. It was standing there. It was not a wolf. It was not a man. It was a biological mistake, an obscene parody of both. It stood over 7 feet tall, hunched and thick, covered in patchy, coarse, filth-matted dark fur that looked like wet carpet. Its limbs were too long, ending in massive, shovel-like hands with claws that were not fingernails, but curved, dark pieces of bone, easily 3 inches long. The head was what cemented the horror. It was a nightmare fusion, the long, snout-like jaw of a wolf, but with the short, wide, almost Neanderthal brow of a man. Its teeth, visible even when its mouth was closed, were not neat canines, but uneven, dagger-like shards, stained brown and yellow. There was no nobility, no mythic grace. It was just a brutal, horrifying engine of violence. It didn't look at the window first. It looked at the door, sniffing the wood where my body had just been pressed. Then, with a slow, dreadful turn, its eyes, those terrible yellow apertures, locked onto mine through the glass. I recoiled, falling back onto the rough-hewn floorboards. It knew I was there. It didn't growl, it didn't even seem to breathe for a moment. It just stared. That's when the siege began. It started with the creature testing the perimeter. I heard its heavy, dragging footfalls circling the cabin. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. Then it started to tear at the window frame with those awful claws, the sound of splintering wood and shrieking metal hinges. I pressed myself against the far wall, shotgun held tight, sweat plastering my shirt to my back. I had canned goods and a few gallons of water. I could last maybe 3 days. The beast, I was sure, could last forever. It spent the next hour relentlessly attempting to breach the cabin. It didn't use tools or tactics, it used pure, hateful strength. It didn't speak or make any complex sound, just that wet, heavy breathing, interrupted by sudden, explosive grunts of effort as it ripped off a shutter or battered the porch railing into matchsticks. Around midnight, a terrifying silence fell again. This was worse than the noise. I heard nothing for nearly 30 minutes. I finally risked moving to the pantry, needing to refill my canteen. As I did, I glanced out the back window toward the woodshed. The woodshed door, secured with a thick chain and padlock, was wide open. The chain was twisted into a grotesque knot, and the padlock was lying yards away, cracked in half. I froze. The thing wasn't just tearing things up, it was looking for something. Suddenly, a massive shape dropped from the roof onto the porch above my head. The cabin shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. It had found the weakest point, the old, rotting skylight above the living room, mostly covered by pine needles. The creature's silhouette was framed against the dark, cloudy sky. It was trying to haul itself up and tear through the shingles. I knew I couldn't shoot up, the old roof would give way entirely and I would be fighting it indoors. I had to move. My only chance was the crawlspace access in the kitchen, a tiny square cut into the floor, covered by a rug. I dropped to my stomach, pushing the heavy rug aside, and lifted the latch on the wooden door. The noise I made was minimal, but in the echoing silence of the attack, it sounded like a gunshot. As I slipped down into the damp, dirt-floored crawlspace, I heard the final, desperate lunge on the roof. The creature's weight, combined with its furious tearing, finally broke through. I heard a cascade of shingle, plaster, and broken wood as it plunged into the living room, landing with a sickening, heavy thump directly where I had been standing moments before. I was safe, for now. The crawlspace was maybe 3 feet high, a tight, claustrophobic tunnel of earth and spiders. I could hear the beast moving above me. It was not running, it was smashing. It was systematically destroying the interior of my cabin, venting its frustration on the walls, the furniture, and the floorboards above my head. Each crash was a terrifying promise of what would happen when it found me. Then, the smashing stopped. I heard the rhythmic thud of a heavy object against the wooden floor, followed by the awful, rasping breath. It was standing directly above the access hatch. It could smell me. I moved, inching on my belly through the dirt, aiming for the foundation vent on the far side of the cabin, a small opening maybe a foot high, covered by a flimsy piece of wire mesh. Thump. 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 The floorboard directly above me strained and cracked. The beast was stomping, testing the strength of the wood. The fear was a physical chokehold, rendering me dizzy and nauseous. I knew it would just take a few more solid blows. I reached the far corner and started digging at the wire mesh with a rusted pipe I found. The dirt flew up around me, covering my face and eyes. Above me, the creature made a sound. It wasn't a growl, but a kind of deep, frustrated, resonant chuffing sound, the sound of a great, ugly machine failing to start. Then, with a final, desperate heave, the pipe bent the wire mesh just enough. I squeezed through the opening, tearing my clothes and scraping my skin on the jagged edges, rolling out into the cold, foggy dawn. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care about the truck, the maps, or the shotgun now uselessly stuck inside the cabin. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs turned to lead, following the faint outline of the logging road away from that place. I ran for 5 hours until I stumbled onto the main state road and collapsed, covered in mud and freezing cold. A kind trucker picked me up and drove me into town. When the police eventually went back, they found the cabin absolutely destroyed, the interior looking like a blender had been turned on full blast. But they found no body. The door was still bolted, the skylight was the only apparent entry, and there was no trail of footprints leading away from the cabin. They chalked it up to a massive black bear attack, maybe several. They didn't see the buckled steel of the truck door. They didn't see the padlock twisted in half. They didn't see the two yellow, malignant eyes staring through the damp window. I know what I saw. I know what I escaped. I live in a city now, the noise and light are a constant, comforting distraction. But every time the wind carries a certain sound, a low, ragged sigh of air, or when I see a flash of yellow in the darkness, I know it's still out there. And I know it's still hungry.